between these two former presidents?
Well, I wrote the book because I had a story to tell, and I had a lot of record to clear up after all these years. But people have been talking to me after I worked with President Nixon and so close to Nixon and Reagan for so many years. Why don't you write a book? And so finally, after I found the time to do it, I had to earn a living before all that, so I found the time to write the book. But there was a lot of contrast between the two of them, obviously. Richard Nixon had a formal career in politics starting in 1946. He was a congressman, and then a senator, and then vice president of the United States. And he was steeped in politics.
Tricky Dick.
Reagan had a different pathway to his political career. He was an actor, but then he got steeped into politics through his time with the Screen Actors Guild, when the communists tried to infiltrate the Screen Actors Guild, and then he was very upset with it. And then as he got more and more steeped in the political side of it, then he got some advice from when he became involved with the General Electric Theater as his acting career diminished. He got some advice from the CEO of General Electric to actually go see Richard Nixon to get some advice on getting into politics. And at that time, Reagan started traveling on the General Electric circuit. So the two of them had a different pathway into politics. Nixon was a combative politician, trained as a lawyer, and Reagan trained as an actor. But they were both communicators in a very different way. Richard Nixon was a very effective communicator using facts and argumentation. Ronald Reagan
And he was a veteran, I believe.
Illustrations and communication, and in a way to show people a pathway to argumentation that was quite different than Nixon's. He would find ways to display facts in a way that, for example, to show that the dollar had diminished in value. Like in 1981, we had a speech to show that the dollar diminished. He said, well, instead of saying it was 36 cents, the dollar was worth 36 cents of what it was years ago, I'll take out a quarter, a dime, and a penny and put it on the table here and show, and that's how he would do it.
Ken, you made the point that Ronald Reagan, even before he became president, back when he was president of the Screen Actors Guild, was fighting communism. And, this took place, before he was the governor of California, before he was the president of the United States. Take us sort of behind closed doors, if you will. What was his demeanor like? What was it like during the height of the Cold War when he was, taking down that wall?
Well, it was, to him, it was a monumental fight against good and evil. He gave a speech about the evil empire. And to him, the way the communists tried to infiltrate the Screen Actors Guild was a very terrible thing. But then when he became president, it was a, scratching and fighting and international, the fact that communists had international contempt for the freedom of Americans and the international world order was very important to him. And so when he came into office, the whole American way of life was something that was critically important to him. The American crusade for free enterprise, for hope, for freedom. He was troubled. In 1968, the Russians invaded Afghanistan, and so that and the fact that they were fueling terrorists all over the world. So it was a very troubling time for him. And the Cold War embedded everything that was done in the 60s and the 70s. The Vietnam War was very much a part of the life he confronted, even as governor in the 60s and 70s. That was one of the reasons Nixon and he were very close, was that he supported Nixon on the Vietnam War, which was very much a fight against communism. So even as he entered the presidency, the fight against communism was very much on his mind.
What do you think drove him?
On the fight against communism, the fight against, a matter of fighting for freedom of the American people. Freedom was a cause that went to his soul, went to his very soul, embedded in him, that he believed so much in it, that not just the freedom to move about or freedom of thought and the very basic things, but it happened to the freedom of the individual. That was the capacity of the American economic system, free enterprise, the freedom to be able to build a company the way you wanted. He was in the Hollywood business. He was so troubled. One of the things that troubled him in the way was for the lower taxes, for example, was in the height of his Hollywood career, he was making big bucks. He was taxed at 90% of his income, and that to him was went against the freedom of his ability to be successful.
Ken Kachigan, really fascinating, excellent new book, Behind Closed Doors.
Yeah.
Really appreciate you joining us.
Good. Well, go to my website, www.reaganandnixon.com.
Excellent.
Thank you.
And that is all we have for you tonight on the Capitol Report. For round-the-clock original news coverage, visit us at ntv.com/live and download our NTV mobile app. From Washington, D.C., I'm Steve Lance. Have a nice
incident where exploding pagers and walkie-talkies killed at least 37 people and wounded around 3,000 in Lebanon and Syria. An attack being blamed on Israel, although they deny it, is shining a spotlight on how ordinary technology can be weaponized through war. Washington Examiner said this in an opinion piece. It said inflicting serious damage on a terrorist organization should be celebrated, but the Israeli method, they say, has the additional benefit of being a warning that the United States should be wary of continuing to rely on Chinese supply chains for critical goods in our economy. Much has been reported on China's efforts to secure dominance over minerals in our supply chain, but Hezbollah's plight underlies these specific risks of sabotage of technical devices. They say take the ubiquitous iPhone. Despite Apple being an American company, key components of almost every iPhone, including the battery, processor, and camera, are made in China. While China does not have access to Apple's source code, or at least so it is believed, the Chinese Communist Party's dominance over the country's private sector affords it great latitude of action. Briefly on that, the Chinese Communist Party actually requires many tech companies, when they go to China, to provide their source codes. I'm not clear on whether Apple has done so, but that normally is one of the things you have to do if you want to get into the business in China. And so the CCP does have the source code of a lot of different systems. If you have the source code, basically you can access everything. And one of the problems you have with manufacturing any product in China, for example, batteries or processors or whatever else, is that there's software at the surface level. You turn on your phone, you see the normal functions, but there's also software at the hardware level. They call it firmware, and that you cannot access. One of the things we've seen previously with Chinese, cyber attacks and so on, is they have what are called embedded threats. They have threats at the firmware level, threats that you can't access the surface, threats that, even if you erase your phone or delete everything or whatever else or reset it, it's still there because it's beneath the surface. And so that kind of access does exist. I also talked before about, for example, video games and the problem, for example, of anti-piracy software, especially when China does it, that can grant them kernel-level access to your machine, meaning they can access the deepest level of your device you can possibly have. They can access and view everything. But back to this, it says that secretly sabotaging tens of millions of iPhone batteries so they overheat on command may seem far-fetched, but it is doable. The risk of malevolent Chinese action with these devices or other technical goods must be considered a real possibility. They say China is also a major supplier of broadcasting equipment, computers, and office machine parts. All these products are sabotage threats. Now imagine that scenario. Imagine, for example, that tomorrow there's a war with China, right? And the Chinese Communist Party, based on its own military strategies, publicly stated, launches a massive cyber attack prior to that invasion. What happens? Well, the satellites all go down. There's maybe an EMP attack, but maybe prior to that, every car battery explodes, every lithium-ion battery explodes. Every single device that's not connected like that shuts down or has other issues. Imagine the disasters, the fires, for example, in South Korea, they had an incident where an electric vehicle's battery exploded in an underground garage and burned up the whole place. Imagine that happening on a large scale. Imagine the roads all congested, emergency vehicles not being able to function. Imagine even beyond that, if, for example, even beyond just vehicles exploding, if there were remote access to electric vehicles or different key components and things were remotely controlled, maybe cars accelerate and crash, maybe the steering wheel jerks, which is possible, by the way, you can do it remotely. And imagine if manufactured car accidents were to happen on a very large scale across the entire U.S. That is what a war would look like. Were these vulnerabilities manipulated? Now look, an attack like this, it sounds like science fiction, but it's actually not far-fetched. Vulnerabilities like these, in fact, everything I just described, has been publicly demonstrated. In fact, even as far back as 2011, there was an Apple security expert, Charlie Miller, who showed how a hacker can breach a MacBook and then cause its battery to explode. Ars Technica said this is way back 2011. It says, quote, according to Miller, these controllers can be hacked in a fairly straightforward manner. By programming the microcontroller's firmware, again, the software at the chip level, a battery could report a much lower internal voltage or current, causing the charger to overcharge the battery. It says in Miller's testing, he was only successfully able to turn a series of 7 $130 MacBook Pro batteries into expensive bricks, but he told Ars, this media, that it may be possible to cause fire or even an explosion. And it said Miller also told Ars the battery firmware hack could be used to create a sort of permanent malware infection, meaning that you can't get rid of it. It says that such malware, or at least a portion of it, could be installed in the microcontroller's flash memory, even if an infected computer's drive were replaced, when the operating system reinstalled. It's possible that an exploit could allow the malware to reload from a laptop's smart battery system firmware. You can control it, in other words, regardless what you do to try to stop it. Now, of course, it's not just laptop batteries either. Attacks like what we just witnessed using pagers, this big attack we just saw take place, that could be used on other electronics, including for deadly uses. Back in October 2011, for example, a hacker demonstrated how he could kill a person by wirelessly breaching their insulin pump, if you're diabetic, of course, and causing that insulin pump to deliver a lethal dose. More of this, in fact. In 2018, researchers of the Black Hat Security Conference, they showed how they could breach a person's pacemaker, again for their heart, and cause it to administer shocks or even just shut down. Imagine that being used, for example, for targeted, maybe assassinations or something of that sort. Now, hackers have even demonstrated how they can seize control of vehicles, including while they're driving. And they can cause the vehicle to accelerate. They can make them shut off. They can essentially control any part of the vehicle that's accessible through its electronic system, which is just about everything. In fact, Wired did a video on this way back in 2015, where one of the reporters drove a Jeep SUV that was then remotely taken over by two individuals, Charlie Miller and Chris Valesk, who were using their laptops to hack the car's system from miles away. Watch this.
I'm going to act as today's crash test dummy and drive it on the highway here in St. Louis, while Charlie and Chris hijack its digital systems from Charlie's house miles away.
So first we're going to turn the fan on him.
Yeah, let's turn the fan on, see if he even notices.
Alright, something just turned on, all the fans and AC and stuff. I didn't do that. But as I drove down the interstate, things started getting unpleasant and very loud.
We gotta turn it down. Kill the engine.
So we're killing the engine right now.
It says park sense. Actually, can accelerate. I stomped on the gas, but the Jeep slowed to a crawl.
Now, here's a bit more context on that test and what the car hacking code that Miller and Valasek developed can do. Now, this is Wired back in 2015. It said the Jeep's strange behavior wasn't entirely unexpected. A come to St. Louis to be Miller and Balasek's digital crash test dummy, a willing subject on whom they could test the car hacking research they've been doing over the past year. The result of their work was a hacking technique, what the security industry calls a zero-day exploit, something, in other words, that has no way of stopping, that can target Jeep Cherokees and give the attacker wireless control via the internet to any of thousands of vehicles. The code is an automaker's nightmare. Software that lets hackers send commands through the Jeep's entertainment system to its dashboard functions, steering, brakes, and transmission, all from a laptop that may be across the country. A demonstrated vulnerability. And keep in mind, folks, this is about 10 years ago, meaning it's probably gotten a lot more advanced. And keep in mind, too, these are just private researchers, not like a foreign intelligence agency or military. Now, look, that particular hack, that whole thing, had actually even been demonstrated a couple years prior to that during the DEF CON Hacker Conference back in 2010, 2011. In fact, in 2013, these hackers, so those previous ones weren't really made public, but in 2013 they did make it public. The hackers at that conference, they made the code publicly available so that anybody can launch these types of attacks. In fact, they demonstrated the attacks on several types of vehicles from several major car makers. This isn't just one car maker. And keep in mind, too, this is more than a decade ago. This was before we had the type of smart cars we have now. This is before electric vehicles. This is before autonomous driving. This is much less advanced and much less technically reliant than the current cars you have on the roads. Meaning, of course, that the things you could control were you to breach them at this level has become more severe. Now, at that time, more than a decade ago, they could cause the vehicles to brake. They could take control of the steering wheels, including making the car jerk. They could cause issues with various other parts in the cars. And look, when it comes to modern-day cars, again, this is becoming one of the big concerns with Chinese-made vehicles. And notably, with the recent issue of exploding pagers in these walkie-talkies, they say the pagers might have been hacked remotely. It seems the batteries exploded. The walkie-talkies might have had actual explosives in them. The pagers are the ones raising more concern because, look, they just created a very viewable, very public scenario demonstrating how electronics can be weaponized. And in fact, now the U.S. government is planning to push for a ban on Chinese software and hardware in vehicles based on these exact concerns. Forefront after a recent incident in Lebanon and Syria where exploding pagers and walkie-talkies killed at least 37 people and wounded around 3,000. The attack is being blamed on Israel. Israel denies it, right? Plausible deniability. And now Chinese technology, notably, is being brought up in light of this. And it's even becoming a big concern. The U.S. government is looking to create a ban on Chinese hardware and software in vehicles. And there's a lot of concerns over national security threats if they don't do it. CNN just said this. The U.S. Commerce Department on Monday will propose a ban on the sale or import of smart vehicles that use specific Chinese or Russian technology because of national security concerns, according to U.S. officials. It says a U.S. government investigation that began in February found a range of national security risks from embedded software and hardware from China and Russia in U.S. vehicles, including, it says, the possibility of remote sabotage by hacking and the collection of personal data on drivers. Secretary of Commerce Gina Raimondo told reporters Sunday in a conference call. They said, quote, in extreme situations, a foreign adversary could shut down or take control of all their vehicles operating in the United States, all at the same time, causing crashes or blocking roads, she said. It notes the rule would not apply to cars already on the road in the U.S. that already have Chinese software installed, a senior administration official told CNN. It'd be kind of hard to recall all of those. Now, look, something like this, again, wouldn't be far off. Even for countries to use attacks like this as targeted assassinations or punishment for criticism, right? Imagine, for example, a U.S. official criticizes human rights abuses in China. Suddenly, his Chinese-made car just shuts off. Can't turn it on again. we actually just saw something like this. We recently saw, for example, Elon Musk allegedly remotely disabled the Tesla Cybertruck of a Russian warlord and also a leader of the Czech Republic after he mounted a machine gun on a Cybertruck. He claimed again that he did that, made a big show of it, and his vehicle was remotely shut down. He could no longer use it. Now, like, in terms of the ban on Chinese and Russian tech and vehicles, that would also be a pretty major move, especially since the Chinese Communist Party has been aggressively trying to push its EV market. In fact, the U.S. government right now is saying they want to avoid a scenario like we had back in 2000, when the Chinese Communist Party again pushed into the international markets. They had overcapacity, they built too many of something, they dumped it on the market at cheap prices, they put their competitors out of business, they established a monopoly, and then they dominated the market, and again, kind of rode that for close to 2 decades. They do not want a repeat of that. And notably, electric vehicles are kind of one of the big next turning points. EVs, semiconductors, AI. Now, like, the issue with EVs is that you need infrastructure to support them. And so for the Chinese Communist Party having an issue now of overcapacity, which countries have infrastructure that would even allow you to feasibly drive an electric vehicle? Well, that cuts out most of the southern hemisphere, right? A lot of those countries do not have the infrastructure to support that. Pretty much, if you're going to do that, you're limited to Western Europe, the United States, maybe parts of Canada. It's not feasible in most countries. And so for that market to work, they need access to those markets. The problem the CCP has, many countries that actually have that infrastructure are currently in a trade war with the CCP. Now, given the current situation, legislation like this already could have gotten some strong support. But look, in light of the recent pager explosions, it's possible that that incident could also become part of the debate. We've now witnessed, and everybody now understands, that these things are possible. You can weaponize ordinary electronics. Now, look, this was actually raised during a recent interview on Fox's Sunday Morning Features with Blackwater founder Eric Prince. Watch.
Now, Gordon Chang, who is an expert on China, said this to me. Remember, Israel had to infiltrate the supply chain. China doesn't have to do that because it is the beginning of the supply chain. They manufacture all of this stuff. So we're talking about pagers, walkie-talkies, remember, also home solar systems, which means your toaster. You can do all of these devices, and it can be laced with explosives. This has raised questions about China being in control of the global supply chain and what the CCP could do with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an extreme vulnerability that we have, whether it's even the processing of rare earth minerals to the manufacture of the integrated circuits to the guts of many of our appliances to even pharmaceuticals. Imagine what they could do to painkillers or to basic antibiotics or to a lot of the things that are still made abroad. It speaks to having to have control or visibility or at least friendshoring of that. And again, an intelligence community that is bold enough to try those kind of things to push back on our enemies.
Now, this also raises the issue of the whole supply chain, right? How all of this could be weaponized in the event of a conflict. Now, this was actually brought to light pretty far back during the Obama administration when, again, hackers were demonstrating the capabilities of breaching different systems, shutting down cars, remotely controlling vehicles, hacking insulin pumps, killing people with their pacemakers. All these things were possible because what was happening at the time, right? People were talking about the Internet of Things. You had a popularization of the Internet that really started with the introduction of the iPhone. The Internet went from being kind of a nerd thing to being something that everybody had right in their pockets. The whole world changed suddenly. Social media started coming about. People were on it. It was a very different environment. And then you had hacker groups come out. 2010, 2011, you had groups like, for example, Anonymous, right? This anonymous hacker group. You had, for example, the Chinese Communist Party demonstrating some of the first publicly recognized cyber attacks. For example, the Aurora attack, wherein they were hacking Google. Those attacks brought government attention. They started looking at, well, how else could this be used? That started raising concerns over the supply chain. And they started looking into, well, what components do we have in our military vehicles, in our fighter jets, and the components we would need to fight a war. And if these hackers, independent kids sometimes at these conferences, are showing that they can breach these devices, they can remotely control these devices, they can shut down these devices, what happens if we went to war and, for example, our adversary, China in this case, were to have access to that through a cyber attack and could just shut down our military? Well, that became one of the big concerns. That started a whole look at the supply chain. And supply chain threats became a buzzword. It was something, of course, that they cared about in the Trump administration, so they talk about now under Biden. And now we're seeing it come to the forefront because the supply chain threats they've been talking about for a very long time are now becoming a stark reality. These
My
threats
medical
are now
records
right in
got
front of
hacked.
us. Now, this is also notably in context of Chinese Communist Party spy and cyber operations. The CCP, aside from just the supply chain threat, right, the fact that they manufacture these components, companies going there have to provide their source codes in many cases. The Chinese Communist Party's data laws require these companies to grant access to their systems. Nothing can be hidden from the CCP if you're working in China. And notably because they control the factories, who knows what they're putting in these devices. That's one of the big concerns. And also the part of maybe not even installing cyber, breaches and so on like that, but maybe just not making something totally secure on purpose. Leaving what they call back doors. You leave the back door open so that the thief can get in and steal whatever they want. That's the kind of stuff that became some of the big concerns. Now, the other side of it is cyber war. The Chinese Communist Party now is recognized to have a large-scale cyber army. This is a military operation for them. They use this also for industrial theft, meaning it's not just military against military, it's military against business. The CCP was just recently found launching a large-scale cyber operation against the United States. This one seemed to be more about spying and information. Washington Post said this: